first, before we get into that, let me just tell you that I missed you guys last week. I'm so sorry. We didn't get a chance to put out a show because hey, things get a little crazy. But we are back this week and I want to thank you for tuning in. If you are a subscriber to this show, I want to thank you one more time for subscribing to the Savvy and Professional because it really means a lot to me. If you want to get in touch with me, if you want to give us ideas on what you want to hear, the types of guests, you can hit us up at twitter.com/thesavvyYP, or you can hit me up personally on twitter.com/Tanida Marie. Now, on to our guest. Today's show, we have Jennifer Dziura. She is an entrepreneur and she's the founder of GetBullish.com. But Jen is just not your typical entrepreneur. Jen is gonna give it to us straight on this show. I want to warn you that this show might have a little bit of adult language in it. So this is a fair warning. Jen is gonna give it to us straight with no chaser, just the way that we like it. So once again, if you have kids in the car, this might not be the time for you to listen to this show, but we're talking about everything about horrible bosses, how to deal with them, how to manage yourself, and how to kind of manage them. So if you're interested in learning about how to deal with horrible bosses, the different types of horrible bosses, then stay tuned to this show because Jennifer has some really good ideas and stories to help you navigate that situation. And hey, if some of this sounds familiar in some of your characteristics, you might want to listen to because maybe it could give you a little bit of a slight edge on how to change that. So without further ado, here we go. Welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
This is an audio podcast, so you don't have to worry about anything.
Well, I wore my lipstick just for you then.
Thank you. I should have put some on. I wasn't even ready. I was like, I don't want her to talk to a picture. Okay, so let me give everybody a little bit of idea. I basically was reading the Daily Worth last week, and I stumbled upon your article titled "How to Handle a Bad Boss," and I just was laughing from the beginning to the end, and I don't know if it was laughing because it was funny or because I could truly 100% connect to almost every single person that you described in that article. So, how did you, I guess before we get into that part of the interview, tell us a little bit about your career path and how you got to where you are now.
Oh, okay. Well, I began actually as a newspaper columnist writing for a local newspaper in Virginia when I was a teenager. So I was that's a weird place to start my story, but that's where I'm starting it. So I was in junior high school one day in English class, and this newspaper editor came by for career day. And I found her later, found her phone number and looked her up and gave her a call. And I said, this newspaper does not have the perspective of 13-year-olds. And she said, that's very interesting. And she said, send me an article. And I actually sent in my first article. This was actually this was in the 90s. And so I sent in my first article on notebook paper in the mail. Like I actually physically put it in the mail.
Wow.
And the article was published, but I actually sent my articles through the mail, handwritten on notebook paper for like 2 years. And then finally, my family didn't have a computer, so finally someone from the newspaper gave me an old typewriter they weren't using. So that was how I got started. And I'm not that old. Like I'm not as old as that story makes me sound, but I don't know. We didn't have a computer. So anyway, so I went to college and I majored in philosophy. And about halfway through college, I got really tired of being a college student and kind of embarrassed for people to think I was still in college. Like I was very wanting to be 30 when I was 20. And so I started a company halfway through college. It was an internet marketing company. Originally, I started designing websites. I taught myself HTML, designed websites all around campus, and then started getting some outside clients. I had a really interesting business lesson when I was about halfway through college when, I knew HTML, I did some basic graphic design, I was making websites, but I realized I needed to learn to do some coding. And at the time, the thing to learn was Perl, the programming language. And so I went and I got a book from the library and I went to the computer lab and I was starting to teach myself how to code in Perl. And it was this bizarre moment where, the book actually got really difficult by about page 2. And I'm trying to teach myself to code. And on page 2, I'm just like, this is harder than I thought. And I look right next to me and there's this kind of greasy guy in a hoodie. and he's coding away, and I'm just kind of like, I'm looking at him and I'm like, that guy is going to work for me. That's, I don't have to learn this. And it's actually really shocking when you've spent your whole life in academia, like when you've, been to school for, say you're halfway through college. At that point, you've been in school for 15 years and you're, like 19. You've been in school your whole life. So it's actually really startling to realize that learning is not always the answer and learning is not always cost effective. In any case, I did end up hiring not that guy exactly, but a bunch of guys like him. And I had about 8 part-time employees by the time I graduated. And then that company failed ultimately after 5 years. And then I moved to New York and I did a lot of really weird shit, including entertaining the troops in the Middle East as a stand-up comedian and running a lot of little businesses. And ultimately, it all came together when I started writing a column called Bullish that gave business and career advice for young women. And the column really goes to places where I feel like I like to write for people who don't normally read business and career advice. So there are some articles on Daily Worth, which is a great site, but I originally started writing articles on The Gloss, which is a fashion and beauty site. So I was kind of hitting people where they were not expecting to be reading about careers. And I think that's been really successful, kind of talking in a more irreverent and fun and sort of I don't know, I feel like I write for people who want to do their own thing rather than people who want to just lean in really hard. So I've been running Bullish for about 5 years now, and we have an annual conference.
Awesome. Yeah, I checked out the website. I think it's awesome. And I started to kind of get lost in some of the things that you were writing. It was pretty interesting. You even said in the bio was like, basically, this is a website for people who just kind of like need to check things out before they lean in. Like, don't just go for it. You need to know where you are. Okay, so the first we'll go ahead and we'll get into kind of this bad boss talk. My audience, a lot of them are young professionals. A lot of them are not young professionals, to be honest with you. They're just professionals, minus the young. But everybody has to deal with working with a bad boss at some point. And so I remember reading the first part of the article, and it said, sometimes your boss is not an evil person or a bad person. They're actually good people. So talk to me about that part.
Sure. I mean, I think that sometimes people get into roles that don't suit them, and for a lot of reasons. When someone's hired in a managerial role, someone's hired to be your boss, you'd like to think that the boss above them scoured the entire earth to find the perfect person to manage you and be in charge of your department and appreciate all your hard work. But of course, that's not true. I mean, your boss's boss, whoever hired that person who's your boss, maybe your department's not that important to them, or maybe they wanted to hire their friend, or they wanted to go with someone they know. So they picked the best person in the company, even though that person was not that good. There are a million reasons. Maybe they're just bad at hiring. Maybe they didn't spend that much time making a decision. Maybe they thought it would be a good decision and the person just didn't work out. There are just a million reasons that there can be a bad fit. And that's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's also the case, that people who are bad bosses, sometimes they have no idea. Sometimes they like being a bad boss and like whatever's awful about them, they're really enjoying it because they're terrible people. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's just a bad fit and everybody kind of knows it. I mean, sometimes a bad boss knows that they're a bad boss and they kind of feel like shit all the time. And so if that's your situation, like they know it's a bad fit, they know they're in over their head, they're managing people who are, for instance, technical people. A non-technical person is managing technical people, so the manager kind of feels like an idiot a lot. There are all kinds of situations like that. And, it's not just, I think that one way to dig into figuring out how to deal with your specific problem is to try to sort that out. It's not about you. It's not like I have a problem with my job and my boss at my job. There's a larger problem involving the whole company. So you need to sort that out and say, okay, like how do I think my boss feels about this? Does my boss know that she's doing a terrible job? Does she feel bad all the time? Does she think she's doing a great job and she's just oblivious? Which of these is it? Because that problem is not, if you only think of the problem from your own perspective, you're going to be very limited in your solutions.
That's really interesting that you said to kind of look at it from, another point of view other than just saying this person is bad and that's just it. Like trying to dig in and figure out why that person might be the way that they are. I find that in a lot of situations, people tend to reverse the problem. So I'll hear someone tell me a story, and right off the bat, I can instantly tell that this isn't an issue with them. But for some reason, they have internalized this to the point where it's them. It's no one else around them. It's something that they're doing. They're awful. They're terrible. Whatever it is. So how can someone tell if it's a bad boss and it's not? It's not them.
I think that you can actually be a lot more direct in asking for feedback than a lot of people assume. I think a lot of people kind of slurk around, and I don't know if slurk is really a word. I mean, I was going for slink there. In any case, a lot of people kind of slink around an office as though they're doing something wrong when they're not. If you're in a situation where you feel like you don't know where you stand with your boss is getting on your case and you're not really sure if it's a personal problem or if you're actually doing a bad job, like you just don't have that information. A lot of people act kind of sneaky and like they're doing something wrong, and you're not. I mean, that's a problem that not only do you want to solve it, probably your manager wants to solve it, hopefully, and certainly the company at large wants to solve it. It's in everyone's best interest for that problem to get solved. So it's not like you're supposed to be all sneaky or like treat it like it's purely a personal problem. Like, don't try to treat that problem with like getting massages and doing yoga after work. Like, that is not the answer to that problem. That's a Band-Aid solution. The answer to that problem is really figuring out what's going wrong there. And I mean, if it's really serious, like if you're being abused, then, you can go to HR, you can go to the person above your boss. But if we're just talking like my boss is riding my ass, my boss is such a jerk, my boss doesn't appreciate anything I do, so on and so forth, those kinds of things that are not actionable. I think that there are very polite ways that you can talk about that. You can get some time on the boss's schedule, ask for a meeting and say, hey, I'd like to get some feedback on what I'm working on. Don't make it about you personally. Don't make it about feelings. Definitely don't make anything about feelings. Ask for, can I get some time on your schedule to talk about the project or to get some feedback on my work on the project or to ask your advice about this project? And then, you go into that meeting and, at most, I mean, you can't, you want to deal with that problem directly in the sense of asking for feedback, but you have to use, I think, business type language. And that's really hard for a lot of people. I mean, there's a book that I recommend a lot called Limbo by Alfred Lubrano, and it's specifically a book about people from blue-collar environments who ended up in Ivy League schools, and they're trying to navigate what he calls WASP talk. And so he's specifically talking about like people the author himself tells an anecdote about how he's Italian American from Brooklyn. His father was a construction worker. And so, he was raised to speak very directly. And, you kind of like could have a confrontation with someone and then you'd work together just fine, tomorrow, which is a very male way of being, but also just some cultures are more, speak more directly than others. And so he gets into an office environment, the author gets into an office environment. He's working in journalism in a newsroom, and he has a problem with an editor, and he tells his dad about it, the construction worker. And the construction worker father says, I'll tell you what to do with that guy. You just push him up against a wall, and you tell him this. And the author's like, no, like I can't do that. I mean, you don't touch people. Just let's start with that. You don't touch people in an office. And the dad's like, no, I did this at my job and it worked out. It worked out great. And the guy, he's like, no, this is not, it's a different world. So for me, I mean, I feel like my dad was in the Navy. My dad was in the military. My mom didn't work. So I was raised in a household where nobody ever shook hands with anybody. I never shook hands with anybody until I was an adult. My parents didn't shake anybody's hand. Like, just these sorts of business niceties were really pretty foreign to me. And I was always a very direct and kind of sarcastic person growing up. And it's been a problem adapting to a workplace. So in workplace language, it can't be like, why are you always riding my ass? Or why, like, what's your problem with me? Like, you can't say those things. I would say something like, I would ask for that meeting. And, if you work more of like a retail job where you're not having a sit-down office meeting, it doesn't matter. Like if you're a barista, fine. You can say, hey, is there some time today we can talk about, the process for something. Try to make it not exactly about the relationship. Is there some time today we can talk about how to get our work done by closing time? Just something. Can we talk about the process? Can we talk about the work? And then get that little meeting. And then I would start off by actually talking about that, actually talking about the work, and say something like, just talk a little about the work. These are some things I've been working on. Do you have any ideas about what color this should be or what order I should do this thing? Make it about the work. And then I would throw in something like, I've been getting some feedback from you lately that seems like you're not happy with my work. Or you're not happy with this part of my work. You're trying to really minimize it and keep it a very calm conversation. So I've been getting some feedback lately that makes it seem like you're not happy with this part of my work. Like that's office talk right there. Like that's office talk. It's very indirect. it's like it's taken me years to really, I think, tamp it down. I just want to be like, what the fuck is your problem? Like that's what I want to say. And instead it's like, I'm getting some feedback from you lately that makes it seem like maybe you're not completely happy with the way I'm doing this one thing.
Right.
So I'm super, super minimizing what I want to talk about there. And then they might say something like, well, who knows what they're going to say. And maybe maybe it's going to be surprising. Um, I have, for instance, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, where I've caused a problem. I think in one case, yeah, here's an example. I caused a problem in an office without really knowing it. Again, I think it was the direct indirect speech thing, but I was teaching classes for a business, and I was, the teaching the class is the product. It's the main thing the business sells. And I'm teaching the class. So I assume that what I'm doing is the most important thing that's happening. So I show up to teach my class, and a bunch of other people, like someone didn't set up the room right or didn't set up the computer right, something like that. And I don't know, I wouldn't say I yelled at somebody, but I think I was like, oh my God, class starts in 5 minutes and somebody set this thing up wrong. Somebody's got to fix it. Like I kind of yelled for an office yelling. At whoever didn't set up the computer right. And that got back to like my boss's boss or something like that. And I end up in a meeting about how I need to be more pleasant to the staff. And by the time I end up in a meeting where my boss is telling me that, you got to think, like, you got to stop these things way ahead of time. And if people are reacting badly, like, that problem's only going to ripple and it's going to grow. So by the time my boss is telling me, I'm sure there are like 11 people who don't like me at that point. Like, it's way too late at that point. So I think there are two things going on here. On the one hand, one way to deal with a bad boss, I think the way to deal with a bad boss is by addressing it directly, but in somewhat mild, tamped down office type language. So actually talk about the issue, although in a very specific kind of way. I think the other thing is, like with my example here, if you have a bad boss problem or just kind of an office getting along problem, because office language tends to be so tamped down, so mild, oftentimes by the time a problem kind of explodes, there are lots and lots of people who are not happy. And so there probably are other relationships that need to be managed besides the relationship with your boss. If you have a bad boss, other people are suffering, other problems are happening.
Right. And I absolutely believe that it's very rare that by the time you have that talk or, hey, we need to talk, or that email that says, I need to talk to you about something, generally there's things that have built up. And what I've learned or experience that I've had is that there are things that honestly don't have anything to do with you per se. You're just the last one on the list. You're just the one that, you were the one that did the last thing. And so we have to address all issues. And I think you gave some pretty solid advice in that you got to keep it professional, and you also have to keep it about the issues. I think a lot of the times I hear stories of people going to talk to their boss and they have this script and it's all these things before they get to the issue. And I think that's where we get in trouble at sometimes, where we, tell our life story and how the last couple of months have been bad for us, and then we try to figure out what's wrong with our relationship between your boss and your employee, which honestly, I'm a big fan of keeping the personal out, but if you were going to have a conversation, I would definitely flip that. I mean, by the time you start talking personal stuff, you should be like 2 minutes from leaving the office. I mean, the conversation shouldn't start with the personal, but that's my opinion. And it sounds like that's kind of where you were going with that too.
No, definitely. I think that a lot of times people turn to feelings right away. And I actually have something specific to say about this. A lot of people, and especially a lot of women, have been taught to have conversations with this I feel language. Like, instead of saying you did something wrong, it's like, I feel that my contribution is maybe not respected. I feel this, I feel that. And I feel like that kind of like the I feel language, making everything kind of about your feelings instead of about what's actually happening in reality, that is language that's taken from relationship counseling. Like, that's what you do to save your marriage. That's not what you do with your boss. Like, you do that with someone who loves you. Like, that's how you preserve your relationship. And I think it's actually really inappropriate in a lot of office situations because it makes things emotional. And it also, if you're a woman, it sort of brings all this gender stuff into it. It's like, you don't want to have a situation where you're trying to talk about a real problem that's happening and some man is going to write that off as like, oh, like a lady has hurt feelings. Ladies have feelings. She must have her period. Like, that's kind of what it sounds like to some sexist dudes if you start talking about your feelings. So I like to just be very careful about my language. It's not like I feel disrespected. It's like, I'm concerned that some of the responses you've had to my work have indicated you're not happy with the quality of what I'm producing. That's what I would say. I would not say I feel that you don't like my work. I would say some of your responses seem to indicate that you might not be happy with my work product. That's how I would say it. So I pick my language very carefully, and I make sure I'm not falling into any type of gender stereotype or just making things more personal and more sappy and soupy than they have to be.
Right. I'm a big fan of that. I am a fan of let's talk about work and then when we get off, that's it. It's a wrap. I don't and I think when you start talking about feelings, you carry some of that. That's how you end up at home still thinking about it. It just doesn't
Oh,
die
it's the worst. Right. You got to say what you got to say, but you just have to say it right?
and just get
So
out
I
of
want to
there.
say one other really big thing about this topic, if I can. I feel like when we start talking about bad bosses, what always happens is that I could say the best piece of advice in the world, but there's going to be somebody who's like, yeah, but my boss is so bad. And I mean, there are some bad bosses out there. There's going to be somebody who's like, yeah, that's really nice advice, but my boss, like, I don't know, like shits on the floor. I mean, it's gonna be like somebody's gonna have the winning story of like the world's worst boss, right? Uh, so there's gonna be something that's like what I'm trying to say here is that there are a lot of situations that are not fixable. And I think that what you need to do there, I'm really serious about this because I hear this, like even the article you're talking about, there are comments below the article where people are like, what if? And then it's like, my boss shits on the floor. Like, what if it's the worst boss in the world? Those problems are not fixable. And what winners do is they get out. They get out pretty soon and they do it gracefully and they do it well. And actually, they do it often. This is a it's an idea I've been kind of talking about a lot lately. I think a lot of us are raised with this like winners never quit. You can't quit something. Like your parents signed you up for violin lessons. You don't really like the violin, but you can't quit because your parents bought a violin. Like
Yeah.
that kind of thing. You feel bad quitting. Like if you're in school, you can't like quit a sport halfway through the season. That makes you a bad person. Like we're raised to think that quitting is somehow bad. And in the working world, I mean, there are a million jobs out there. Like it's not necessarily easy to get them, but there are a lot of jobs, and you should be working on your network all the time. Like you should know people that other companies, your competing companies. You should know your competitors. You should know just a lot of friends who have cool jobs, and you might want to work with them someday. You should know people in your industry. They should know who you are. Like you need to be networking all the time, even when you have a job and your job is good. That way, if things suddenly turn horrible at your job, you've got a lot of people who are like, oh, yeah, you're available. We'd love to have you. Like, just come on over. You can just jump ship right away. I think people who are really in control of their careers, they are able to get a new job quickly. They have a lot of like irons in the fire, a big network. And when they're not being respected and there's no way to fix it, they just get out and they do it gracefully. Like, they don't stay around for so long that it's horrible every day and they hate themselves and they hate their lives and it's like a toxic workplace, but they're still there and they feel like a martyr. They don't do any of that. People who, have those resources, have that kind of network, they try to fix it, maybe try to fix it again, and then they leave gracefully. Don't even like burn the, no, you don't get to say fuck you on the way out, no matter how much you want to. You leave gracefully and you get a better job. And I think that, it's sometimes very clear to me working in companies that kind of turn bad for whatever reason, like the company's bought by another company, or it just turns bad, like some bad people are hired and it just turns bad. The best people are the people who leave first. It's something and by best, I mean performing in their career. Yeah, like the high powered people, they are out first, they have better jobs right away. They are not sticking around on like a sinking ship. So I think it's really important to always be ready to jump, to know that that's not quitting, that's not losing, like that is winning, to move from place to place so you can be respected and you can contribute and you can work in a respectful workplace. So that's my message for everybody.
Yeah, you kind of led into my next question was basically, do you think that someone can design their own work environment? Because I know, from my personal experience and just experience of people that I know, you learn to work around that in a way that works for you. I've been in situations where maybe a certain person that might be management level or a peer or coworker might not be the most productive in as far as like where I think we need to go or helpful, but you learn to do your job and be a badass regardless.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry you can hear my baby crying. It's going to be on your podcast. On your podcast, my baby is so cute. She has two teeth, and she's getting a third one, so she is super unhappy right now. There's like a big front tooth coming right out of her mouth. She just turned one. So for those of you who are listening and you hear a baby screaming, no one is torturing her. It's she's teething.
This is
Anyway,
real life,
so
man. This is a real podcast.
this is real life. All right, I'm sorry. So what was I going to say? I totally lost my train of thought there.
We were talking about designing your own kind
Oh,
of workplace.
yeah. I think that it depends so much on the kind of job. I think a lot of times when we talk about jobs, you're reading these articles on, career website, everyone is picturing this sort of stereotypical office environment, and so many people do not work that way. If you work in a coffee shop, I don't think that you can design your own work environment. I think that you work, in front of a cash register, or you work in front of an espresso machine, and there's not a lot you can do about it. I think that in a situation like that, it might be possible to change your shifts, try to change your schedule so we're always working under the terrible manager. There might be some things that you could do about that, but in general, I think you need to get a new job, if some things are really bad there. If you're working in an office environment, then sometimes, especially if you have work that can be done remotely, keep in mind, if you're working in an office environment, if you're the receptionist, like you're pretty much stuck to that desk. If you're coding, if you're doing work that can be done from lots of different places. One classic technique and classic in the sense of like the 4-hour work week, kind of classic self-help, is to convince your boss that you should be allowed to telecommute. And one way to do that, I'm sort of, I mentioned the 4-hour work week here and there. It's a good book to read. There are a lot of things in the book that are not ethical and that are kind of gross, but there are a lot of things in the book that are really useful. So I kind of feel like if you get a couple good ideas, a book is worth like $14, even if you hate half of it. So it's a love-hate relationship I have with that book. Anyway, that said, Tim Ferriss has some pretty detailed advice about, trying to untether yourself from your workplace if you have one of those kinds of jobs that can be done from a computer and, from anywhere. And it's basically like he suggests, when you're sick one day or pretending to be sick, work from home that day and make sure you get a lot done. And then when you come back from being sick, you're like, hey, boss, isn't it amazing how much I did from home when I was sick? What if I did that like every Friday? And then, you make sure that your Fridays are like, and just give it like when you ask for that, say, let's just try it for 4 weeks. Would that be okay? I work from home on Fridays just for the next month, just to try it out. So you make it like a really, really small ask, and then you make sure that those next 4 Fridays are the most productive days in the entire world, even to the extent of like being less productive on the other days, just to make the contrast really big. And then when you prove to be the most productive work from home worker ever, then you're like, how about I just do this all the time? And then there's like a guy in the book who goes to China without telling his boss and like works online from China and doesn't tell anyone he's left the country, which raises new problems. So that's a pretty extreme example. But yeah, like in some cases it is possible to design your own work environment if you have that kind of situation and you really want to put a lot of effort into it. But I still feel like the best move for a lot of people is to have a big network and to be well known in your field, to establish expertise, and be able to jump to a new job when needed. Because, the thing is, even if you do this like Tim Ferriss fantasy world where you convince your boss that you should be able to work remotely, even though nobody else in the company does, you're like the one person who gets to work from home or from the beach, whatever. That's great, but are you really going to get promoted? You're not in the office every day. People aren't seeing you. You already have a special deal. Like, how are you going to get to the next level? And for a lot of people who are sort of marginalized in the workplace, FaceTime is really important. If like you are competing against people who have advantages you do not have, I think you need to be there and you need to be in those meetings and you need to get your name and face in front of, the decision makers. So, I feel like, there are a lot of ways that you can cope and a lot of ways you can try to change little things. But in the end, you want to be in a place where you don't have to do that. You want to be in a place where you can succeed and be appreciated and you have a good fit. And so I think that really does mean, being willing and able to look for a new job and having a big network that makes that easy, having your name out there on whatever it is that you do. So, when you go applying for a job, people already know who you are, ideally, or you have an in. You're not, like, you don't want to be uploading your resume to a bunch of resume websites. You don't want that. You want to bypass that. So I'm really kind of going back to that idea. There are ways that you can change little things about your job, but in the end, I think that address it directly, and if it cannot be fixed directly, then I would consider looking for a new job. I
Okay.
also always recommend that people, even if you're not interested in being an entrepreneur, if that's not your main goal in life, I still think everyone should have an entrepreneurial plan in their back pocket. Just because if you know that you could go out on your own and be an entrepreneur, then you're going to take less shit from people in your job. What I don't want is for you to be at your shit job taking shit from some shit manager, and then you need that job so bad to pay your rent, and if you lost the job you don't know what you would do. If that's your situation, you're going to have to take the shit. There's not a lot of options. So I want you to have options. I want you to say, oh, well, if I can't solve this problem in a direct and respectful and sort of professional way, like if we can't all be adults here and fix this, then I'm going to start interviewing for new jobs. Or you can say, screw this company. I'm going to compete with them. Like I'm going to quit and start my own company. I'm going to take all their business. If you can't say one of those things, then you are going to be pretty dependent, and that's not a good position, in a relationship or in a job.
Absolutely. I'm all about that. It's especially, there's someone that I was talking about leaving their job, and they said, you got to have this special account called the FU account, the fuck you account, where if someone just gets you to that level, you look at that account and all the money in there that you've saved, or maybe the, side hustle you have, and say, you know what? I'm leaving. Goodbye. You have a great day. And kind of leave in a way that where you feel empowered and not like, oh man, I might have to call him back in 2 weeks because I really shouldn't have did that.
Right. And so, yeah, that's a good point. I didn't mention that. An emergency fund is like kind of another piece of that. So, I mean, ideally, you're working at your job and things are bad. And so you address it in an adult, professional kind of way. You call for that meeting, you ask for feedback, you see if you can repair the relationship. Great. But kind of the three pieces we've talked about now are number one, you can get a job elsewhere because people know you know them, you have a lot of options. Number two, is if you needed to go out on your own and start your own company, you could. You feel confident that you would know how to do that and have the ability to do that if you had to. And number three, have an emergency fund so you are not worried about where your rent comes from during any period where you are starting up that business or job hunting.
Absolutely. So I want to go into a little bit before we wrap up. In this, how to handle a bad boss piece. You kind of had there are about 5 examples of
Oh,
these
yeah.
bad bosses. And so I want to talk about a few of them just to give people an idea of, kind of where you were coming from and the tone of it. And I'll of course link to the article in the show notes so that people can check it out for themselves. But I guess let me think. I'm thinking the most extreme or like I'm trying to go from one end to the next. So let's start I guess with the disconnected boss and then we'll go to what I think would be the opposite of that. So tell me about the disconnected boss and give me a one tip or maybe two of how somebody could deal with that.
So I don't remember exactly what I wrote in the article, but with a disconnected boss, so the boss has no idea like what your company does or what you do or who the people are who work for them. Like they're just kind of floating around, being ridiculous. In a lot of cases, I think that's probably a bad fit. That's probably somebody who they wanted a different job and they ended up with this one. That might not mean that they're a terrible boss or a terrible person or a terrible worker. It might just mean they have no interest in this job and they ended up in it and for some reason. What you can do there, fortunately that boss is not holding you back. They're not actively sabotaging you. What I would do there is I would take that void of information coming from the boss, just that like emptiness, and fill it up with what you want to be there. So if the boss isn't really doing anything or doesn't seem to know what's going on, you tell them what's going on. Provide them. Don't make it sound like they're doing anything wrong at all. Like you are their source of information. You're kind of doing their job for them, but to your benefit. And so what that means is I would, even if they never want to talk to me, they never want to see what I'm working on, they don't care what I'm working on, I would send an email and I'd be like, hey, can I just come in on Thursday for about 20 minutes and give you a briefing. I love the word briefing because it makes the person you're talking to sound really important. It's not like, can I talk to you? It's like, you are the president and I would like to brief you. So let's go to the situation room. So can I brief you on our project? And then you explain, what everybody's working on and what you're working on in the way you want the boss to see it, which means you're setting yourself up for a promotion, for a raise, whatever. You're like, I managed this, I did that, this guy did this awesome thing, and then I did this awesome thing. And, you keep the boss updated. So I'd be really proactive, keep the boss updated, make sure the boss has all the information. You're kind of saving her ass. Like if her boss asks her what's going on, now she knows. So you're kind of helping her out, but you're also presenting things in the light that you would like her to see them. So that actually can really be turned to your advantage.
Absolutely. So we have the disconnected boss, and I don't know. You tell me. I think the opposite of that would be the buddy boss.
The buddy boss. There are a couple kinds of buddy bosses. I mean, there's like the buddy boss who, wants to go out for beer after work, but not like one beer, more like 5 beers, which is really inappropriate. And then they want to like, at first they're like, hey, work, how's work? And then after like beer number 3, you want to go home, but you can't because your boss is still there and that would be weird. And then they start talking about like their wife or something really awkward. And yeah, so there's like the inappropriately personal buddy boss, but then there's, like, and that's something that sometimes you go to HR for. I mean, sometimes that's so over the line that people are being inappropriate. But, on the other end of the spectrum, the buddy boss is sometimes just somebody who, like, for instance, someone who is your peer and your friend, like they sat at the next desk from you and you really were friends, like you got lunch together, like during, lunch at work. And then they get promoted and now they're your boss. And that's just awkward for everybody. You were peers, you really were friends, and now they're your boss and they don't know how to act like it. And that's the sort of thing where, you can definitely take control of that situation and try to manage the relationship. So, in the first case, it may just be like, it was great having a beer with you. I have to go home now. But in the second case, where it's more harmless, it's more just like someone doesn't know how to be a manager. What I would do in that case is really, you can take control of a situation, but also make it clear that they're the boss and you're the employee. And the way that you do that is like if you have a meeting with them and they're not, and it's just chatting, like their idea of a meeting is just to chat with you, then you need to learn from that and go into a meeting with a little agenda. Like, hey, there are 3 things I wanted to update you about, and I wanted to get your decision on a couple of things. So number 1, we're working on this. Should the logo be red or purple? And then like number 2, here's this thing. We don't think we can have it done by Monday. Is Wednesday okay? And so what you're doing is like going through a checklist, forcing them to make decisions and be a boss. You're making it clear that the relationship is about you ask for information, they give direction. And, I feel like that can be done in such a way. I mean, keep in mind, what's your goal for all of this? Because having a buddy isn't so bad. What's your goal for all of this? Your goal is that you want to be productive and have that on the record so that you can advance. And so that means, if you can help your boss be a good boss, without it being too clear that that's what you're doing, like you're helping your boss be a good boss in a way that helps them advance and also helps you advance, then that's the goal.
Absolutely. Okay, so one question I like to ask my guests before we wrap up is kind of like a reflection piece. If you knew back then, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, what you know right now, today, what would you tell yourself or what would you do different?
Yeah. Well, I think that the really big thing is that I've never liked to work on a team or work with other people or accept help. And that actually caused my first company to fail. Like, I really had this idea that if you start a company and you don't do everything yourself, then when your company succeeds, you don't really get the credit because you didn't do it yourself, like you're cheating. It's like this idea that, again, comes from academia. Like you spend your whole life in school, you absorb these ideas that are about school and they're not about work and they're not about the real world. And so one of those ideas is like, don't look at your partner's work, like work is independent, working together is cheating. And so I think I really always had that idea. Like I had to do everything myself and, I would like go off in kind of a corner and like try to do something and then hope it would be good at the end. And I wouldn't like ask for anyone's feedback while I was doing it. And, I have to say, I mean, I think that I'm not the only one. I don't like feedback. I mean, I don't like it very much. Like it's unpleasant. I think that a lot of people, I know I'm not the only one, like, you're supposed to, it's like exercising. It's like a few people really enjoy it, but most of the rest of us do it because we're supposed to, like if you could, be really healthy and look like you exercise without exercising, you wouldn't go. I mean, who would? Right. And so I think feedback's the same thing. Like we would all like to be perfect without the feedback, but you're supposed to like feedback, so you say you like feedback. Anyway, what I'm saying is that if I knew 15 years ago what I know now, I would have done a lot more collaborating with people and, maybe asking for help with problems before they became much larger problems, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would have, God, I hate to say teamwork because I fucking hate teamwork, but sadly, a little more teamwork. I mean, not like a lot of teamwork, but a little. You can be an entrepreneur. Like you can be an entrepreneur and you can be a superstar and you can still take credit for your work and keep most of the money if you work with other people. So. That's it.
Just a dash of teamwork. Okay.
Just a dash.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the call. It's been fun. I knew it was going to be fun.
Well,
And
thank you for having
where can people find you if they, stumble upon this podcast or they subscribe to this podcast and they want more? They're like, I need to hear more of this woman, Jen. Where can they go?
Thank you very much. It's getbullish.com. So getbullish.com. And that's where you can find all my articles, even the articles on other websites. They're all collected at Get Bullish. I also run the Bullish Conference, which is at bullishconference.com. That is only for women, so sorry, gentlemen. But the Bullish Conference is happening October 10th, 2015 in New York.
Oh, nice. Might be my first trip there. Sounds like
Oh,
fun. I checked it out
that
on
would
the site. Okay, well, I appreciate you coming on. As you can see, the sun is setting over here in Texas. And I guess, is there anything else that you kind of want to get off or your chest or anything else you want to get
be.
out?
I do. I want to say that my whole mission is that I want people to have options and be able to make choices and to set their future self up for success. So my whole big deal, I'm not telling you have to be an entrepreneur or you have to be out at networking events every night. I just want you to have redundancy, like levels of safety and options in place. So when things get bad, you can move on to the next thing and it doesn't hit you so hard. That's what I'm about.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy and Professional podcast. Wasn't that an awesome show? I'm telling you, Jen is not a joke, and I appreciate her full honesty because honestly, it's pretty refreshing. I want to thank you for listening to the Savvy and Professional podcast. If you like this show, go ahead and subscribe. Give us a rating. Tell us how we're doing. And also, if you would like to reach out, let us know what shows you want to hear, what guests you think would be interesting to have on. You can give me some feedback at twitter.com/thesavvyYP. You can also find me at twitter.com/Tanida Marie. That's my personal handle. Don't forget that all of the show notes to this show and every other podcast is on the Savvy Y